All right, I guess we'll get started. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Chris Bortlik. I'm a principal architect at the Microsoft Technology Center here in Boston, Mass. Thanks for joining my session this evening, at least where I am here in Boston, around sentiment analysis for Yammer posts. Apologies for having to reschedule early in the day. Originally, this was slotted at 2 in the afternoon. So hopefully those of you that were looking for the session earlier have found us at the later time slot. And if you're new to this session slot, I appreciate you jumping in and joining us. So in case you didn't hear earlier today, the SharePoint conference has been rebranded as the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference, bringing together SharePoint as well as Teams and the Power Platform. It will be back in person in Las Vegas in March of 2021. So look forward to seeing many of you back there in the spring. I've been with Microsoft about 12 years. My entire focus has been on our productivity solutions. So back in the day it was SharePoint on premises and was part of that transition of moving into BPOS, the online services, about 7 years ago. And I've been working a lot with customers in Office 365, as well as doing things around security and compliance, and have been attending the SharePoint conference and presenting for many, many years. And before I joined Microsoft 12 years ago, I actually spent 14 years myself as an enterprise architect and a customer myself. So again, look forward to continuing to see many of you in the community back at the next event in person in March. In case you haven't heard already, this event is really led by and for the community. Really appreciate all of our partners and sponsors that are making this possible by actually sponsoring this session for us. So this has been, again, a really great community effort by all these folks that are on the screen. So the session we're going to cover here today is going to really focus on three key things. Number one, we're going to talk about some of the business requirements in the scenario that we see when we're developing the solution. We'll go through the scenario demonstration, and then we'll actually go through some of the resources that will actually help you with building the solution yourself. So when I first started out building the solution, probably about a year and a half ago, in my job as an M2C architect, I work with a number of our largest global enterprise customers that are focused around driving consumption of Office 365. Could be customers in regulated industries like financial services or healthcare. And one of the challenges that we've historically had is some companies wanted to embrace Yammer, but they really had some concerns about what if people say certain things, and what if someone says something bad or something negative, and how are we going to know that's going on? How are we going to make sure things have been responded to? So the first use case that often comes up as a common kind of scenario here is customers want to drive engagement. They want to do like Microsoft does, especially in a time of crisis like we're dealing with COVID right now, where our CEO, like Satya Nadella, wants to engage with employees and wants to have bi-directional communication. So really starts off with wanting to drive employee engagement, which is really a key pillar of Yammer as a communications platform. But as I mentioned earlier, some companies, especially those in regulated industries, are afraid that people might say something negative, and I put negative in quotes. The reality is that people might be saying negative things today to each other. They might be saying them via email. They might be doing things in person. They might be using tools that are not sanctioned as consumer tools like Facebook. They might be using applications like Blind to go out there and share negative feedback. So the reality is that our employees sometimes are saying negative things, and we may not even be aware of that. But certainly, there is a concern that, enterprise social tools like Yammer could potentially amplify some of those negative posts. And we want to make sure that people are aware of the feedback, and they can be triaged and responded to appropriately. We want to make sure that the HR representatives, in this case, as we're related to the employee engagement, have visibility into what's being said, and they have a private space to actually work together on responses. So oftentimes we might see in Microsoft's own usage of Yammer, people are constantly posting questions and comments and feedback in our CEO connection. And HR might review them on a regular basis, and then once a month, Satya and his leadership team might be doing a town hall via live events like we're doing today. And they might want to leverage the crowdsourced questions and the feedback that people are bringing up. And they want to actually, again, make sure they're working together to triage the response, or triage together the topics that would be bubbled up as part of the next CEO connection event. So again, those HR professionals need a common shared space that's private for them to collaborate and work on things together. We also may want historical reporting and trends. So maybe there's been a spike in negative sentiment in posts, and maybe there's some correlation we can draw. Maybe it's certainly related to the health crisis we're going through. Maybe it's related to the stock price going down, some change in leadership, some change around benefits, or something else. So having visibility of trends over time can actually help us with identifying, understanding when were things being said that were more positive in sentiment, and when might things have been a little bit more negative, and kind of, again, give us some visibility and reporting over time. Then we might want to also have the ability to leverage out-of-the-box solutions and no-code solutions, as in this case, where we can actually go ahead and do things like this, where we want to enable business analysts, people who are in HR and other departments, to have the ability to actually manage and maintain these solutions without requiring a developer as their needs and as the requirements might change. So again, these are kind of some of the core use cases and scenarios and requirements that again, I often see with customers. And again, used to doing the session in a very live and interactive format. So certainly, I feel free to throw questions in the Q&A. I am monitoring, just so you know, I am the presenter and the producer here. So if you see me looking to my right, I am monitoring the Q&A, and will do my best to certainly throughout the session take some of your questions in here, as well as save time on the back end, and will be available via the social platforms as well at the end. But these are some of the key requirements that we're looking at when we're developing the solution. So those of you that might not have heard before, this has been dubbed as the year of Yammer. A number of great announcements have been made, especially going back to Microsoft Ignite back in the fall, back in 2019 when we were in Orlando together. Yammer has really been rebranded in terms of its look and feel, and you're going to see the new Yammer that's started to roll out to customers. But Yammer has also become a lot more focused in its superpowers, if you would, really focused around three key pillars: driving and developing communities, knowledge and knowledge management, and certainly that'll tie into Project Cortex when that's released in the next few months, and then really focused around employee engagement. So a very common use case for Yammer really is this leadership engagement. It could be with the CEO, it could be with other business leaders from HR or finance or other different departments. Yammer is really focused around company-wide communication, certainly having that ability to use the Yammer app in Teams, having tighter integration of Yammer with Teams and other applications, but really having Yammer, especially in a company the size of Microsoft, being focused around company-wide communication. Yammer's recently, if you haven't seen, added the ability to have different types of posts. So one of the common types of posts is the question type, which is really helpful with knowledge sharing, where somebody can post a question and then other people can respond to the question. And then whoever asked the question or who's ever managing the community can designate those questions as being answered or not. And if those questions have been answered, designate which is the right response. And also have the ability to start to pin common questions or close conversations as well, or again, as those conversations continue to evolve. And then lastly, really focused around driving and improving the employee experience, helping to drive employee onboarding, certainly drive retention of employees, again, drive knowledge sharing across the organization. Really, one of the key things is leveraging Yammer to be really open by default to anyone within the organization. So whereas typically Teams is a bit more private by nature, where you're explicitly inviting in individual people in the organization or outside the organization, Yammer is meant to be open by default within the company to foster inclusive dialogue, certainly around topics around diversity and inclusion, but also, again, getting feedback from others across the organization and making those conversations discoverable, enabling those conversations to be discovered through Microsoft Search, making them eventually discoverable through things like Project Cortex to help us to identify the content, identify people and the topics, and then make them more discoverable, certainly by new employees, as well as folks that have been more tenured in the organization as well. As I mentioned, Yammer's gotten a bit of a refresh recently, certainly on the mobile application, as well as on the web. So recently, we started to roll out the ability for Yammer to go into Microsoft 365 native mode, which means the files can be stored directly inside of SharePoint and Office 365 groups, now Microsoft 365 groups, which means we get things like data loss prevention, e-discovery, certainly some of the search capabilities that are there, but also a brand new mobile application experience as well. So we really want Yammer to be that social fabric that works across all of Microsoft 365. And as I mentioned, integrated into Microsoft Teams, integrated into SharePoint, even having the ability now to receive notifications in Outlook and reply directly back to Yammer notifications from within Outlook as well. And then because it's built on top of Microsoft 365, as I mentioned, getting those enterprise security capabilities that you're seeing built into groups. Again, things like data loss prevention, e-discovery, and a lot of the other compliance and privacy capabilities that are just built into Microsoft 365 as a core platform. So the next part of the demonstration and the discussion is really going to focus around a scenario demonstration. At the end, I have a ton of resources for you. This solution was actually blogged pretty thoroughly, and there's actually a solution accelerator that's put out there, or if you want to build this solution on your own, we've actually put out the building blocks of the solution. And we're going to spend a lot of time walking you through the solution. I'm going to look at it through three different lenses, three different personas, if you would. One is the person that's submitting the feedback. The second persona might be people that are the reviewers of the content, again, the people in the HR department. And then we'll go behind the scenes and we'll look at things as the builder, the people that are building the solution, maintaining the solution, and actually setting the solution up. So let's dive in and take a look at what this looks like. So I'm starting off here in the new Yammer. As I mentioned, this is something that recently has started to roll out to customers where you can actually go in and toggle from the classic Yammer experience into the new Yammer experience. When you do that, you'll notice there's a button that shows up at the top here for users. You as admins can pick and choose whether or not users by default have the new Yammer experience and can turn it off and go back to the classic experience, or whether or not you want them to be in the classic experience and then opt into the new Yammer experience. You notice that the look and feel of Yammer is much more consistent with other parts of Microsoft 365 now. So getting certainly the ability to leverage search and having that common search bar available across the top. You notice that Yammer groups have now been rebranded and changed into communities to really reflect their place in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. As a user, I can actually go in now and pin and favorite these certain communities that are more top of mind for me as well. You notice that here are some of the new post types. So certainly we've had the ability for time to do things like go ahead and give praise and create a quick poll inside of Yammer, but also, as I mentioned, having that ability to go out and ask a question as well. So as I dive in here, you're going to see that we have the CEO Connection Yammer community that's here. The CEO Connection, as I mentioned, could be an open place where people are asking common questions as we're doing here. You could also go ahead and have a link out to other resources like our intranet, employee events, when the next CEO connection is, have your terms of use around what's acceptable behavior when people are posting content here, and things of that nature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and post some feedback or question for the CEO and others in the organization. You notice one of the things here, we do have the ability, because these are based on groups now as well, to actually go ahead and start to label these groups as well. And you can see this has been labeled as being company confidential as well. So people get that marking that, again, these conversations are meant to be within the organization and they're confidential to our company as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, what are we doing to improve our product quality? Lots of customer issues. And I'm going to go ahead and just hit post on that. And again, that's something that people in the past might have gone out and, again, put out on public forums like Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, or again, using applications like Blind as an example. We really want to go ahead and encourage employees to post their feedback, post their questions, and again, have a very open and candid discussion within the organization. But as I mentioned, we might want to actually have these posts be monitored. Again, not being monitored in the sense that we want to stifle people from sharing questions and feedback. We don't want to stifle the conversation. We may want to get more, again, visibility and insight into kind of what sort of questions are being asked out there. So you notice that I'm logged in here inside of Outlook on the web, and this was when I was doing a test yesterday. But you can actually see that this post has actually triggered an email notification, and it's saying that we found a potential negative comment on Yammer. So here is that question or that post that got put out. You can see it has a sentiment score that is around 16% positive. So we're around 84% thinking that this is a negative post that's out there. And we got a direct link that allows us to go out and drill directly into the Yammer community to actually see that conversation as well. But I mentioned earlier that the HR professionals, they may want to have a private space that they're working in. So while email is certainly a great way of sending alerts and notifications, our organization in this case is actually leveraging Teams. And we actually have a private collaboration space that's set up for the HR professionals. You notice that this team actually has 3 different channels in it. There's our general channel. There's a channel we're using to collect and monitor and respond to feedback based on the CEO connection feedback. And there's a private channel, because you notice here that this team, while it's been flagged as confidential, it actually does have 2 guest members in there from outside the organization. And maybe this team has people that are business partners that are working with us around HR benefits or other things. And maybe we want to have a private space within this team for our employees to do things like talk about corporate holidays and other things that might not be something we want to show to outside business guests and vendors as well. So going back into the CEO Connection channel here, you notice that in the past, I had been sending these out as emails. So just grabbing the email address of the channel, I can certainly go ahead and send an email. But one of the things that recently has been added into Microsoft Power Automate, formerly Microsoft Flow, is the ability to directly post from a workflow directly into a Teams channel. So you see in this case is a similar message where I've gone ahead and I've put in a subject line, put in the same body of those of the comment that's coming from Yammer. And again, I put in a link to the thread that's happening out on Yammer. Now I can go ahead and I can say, hey, at another person, maybe Ian, we need to think about how to respond. And I can go ahead and again, we can have this private conversation. Others on the team can come in and they can certainly, like the post, they can go ahead and frown it. They can again add other people to the discussion. Again, really having a single place for having that consistent threaded conversation that's out there. Now we do have the ability to leverage the Yammer app. So we talked before about how we can have the Yammer app pinned to the left-hand rail to bring in the broader Yammer conversations across the organization. But in this case, I'm just leveraging the Yammer tab to actually enable me to bring in the conversations happening from Yammer. So maybe I can go in here and I'm going to say, great question. We will discuss as a team and respond back. So again, have that ability to go ahead and post it. There's also the ability that if I wanted to, and I can do this with any of the Yammer communities that are embedded inside of Teams through the tab, I could also go ahead and share that to my channel and basically post this over from the Yammer conversation again back to an internal private conversation that's happening inside of the Teams channel as well. And you'll notice that if I go back over here into Yammer, here again, I'm kind of talking to myself as wearing kind of 2 different hats here. But again, even though I posted it from within the Teams app inside of the Yammer app inside of Teams, again, I went ahead and posted that back over into the broader Yammer conversation as well. The other thing I can do, as I mentioned, is we can go ahead and look at sentiment analysis over time. So getting visibility into all of the different posts that are out there. And we're going to walk through how the solution is set up in a little bit. But you notice that this solution, as I mentioned, is something that I've been working with for really around 18 months or so. And what you see here is that, going back to January of 2019, we're looking at the average score of all of the posts for a given day. So what you're seeing on this chart is all of the different posts to the CEO Connection community. And you're seeing the average sentiment, the average score over time. So getting a really good, visual indicator. And again, just like anything else that is embedded as a tab inside of Teams, I can go ahead and say, Ian, I can go ahead and talk with Ian and others on the team and go ahead and say, hey, I'm observing by looking at this chart, we're trending down over the last couple of weeks. So really kind of what's going on? Is this just an outlier? Is it 1 or 2 people? Is it certain departments that are expressing negative feedback? Or is there something bigger going on in the organization that we really need to think about? Now, as part of these ongoing CEO Connection, these town hall events, we certainly can go ahead and leverage things like Microsoft Forms to have regular pulses and ask ongoing questions of folks and really, again, assess sentiment during the meetings as well and ask information around topics people want to see and again, what's their sentiment. And we can also go ahead and embed all of the recordings. And in this case, it's embedded into a stream channel. And it looks like that's not loading for me right now, so love the live demo there. But normally I'll go ahead and actually load up the stream channel directly inside of the tab inside of Teams here, which again gives me access to all of the prior live events that were done for the CEO Connection as well. So that's kind of really quickly going through some of the content and the experience from an HR perspective, where we can go in there and actually see the posts, We can see who's posting what. We can look at the sentiment over time. We can also go ahead and, again, look at the reports that are out there as well. Now, we can also publish this out on our HR website. So in this case, we have a corporate intranet that is hosted on SharePoint Online. And on the HR website, we might have an HR chatbot that we're using to ask common questions of HR, sharing information around policies and procedures, such as time off requests, maybe embedding a Power App as an example for crisis support. So how are we dealing with response to COVID-19, or how are we dealing with any sort of event like a tornado or hurricane, any sort of crisis is happening at the organization. But we've actually gone ahead in this case and we've actually put a dedicated page on our HR website that's actually looking at employee sentiment. Now, certainly we can bring in information related to employee sentiment based on a poll. At Microsoft, we call it the Microsoft Pulse, where people are regularly going out there and asking polls on an ongoing basis. So we have a big thing once a year called the Microsoft Poll. We also do regular, once a month or so, kind of pulse surveys that I actually got surveyed for this morning, where we're regularly going out and surveying employees to get their pulse. And certainly we could publish that as a report and embed that in a page. But in this case, we're actually publishing that Power BI report. So maybe we want all employees, or maybe a subset of employees that have access to the site, to get access to that same Power BI report. So just using the Power BI web part and embedding it inside of this HR website, I can embed that same Power BI report directly inside of this page as well, to give employees visibility into the average sentiment over time as well. So that's kind of looking at things from the person asking the question as well as the reviewer. We're going to put on our third hat, put on the hat of the persona that's actually creating this workflow. So as I mentioned earlier, there's actually a blog post that we're going to share with you in the slides. This is actually a session that I presented at Microsoft Ignite back in September. So today's session is being recorded. The session I did back in the fall, back at Ignite, was also recorded, so you can go ahead and watch that recording. This is a slightly updated version of that session to take advantage of some of the newer things, such as the new Yammer experience, as well as some of the Teams integration that wasn't there. But there is, again, that recording is already out there. But more importantly, it actually will walk you through what I'm going to walk you through on how to actually build and set up this flow. And if you click through the first one, the first link that's there, there's actually step-by-step instructions that are going to walk you through how to download the zip file to actually build a similar workflow and configure this inside of your environment as well. So I'm going to go into Microsoft Flow. And this is one of the pre-built Microsoft Flow templates. So if you haven't used Microsoft Flow before, and you actually go in and you look at some of the templates that exist in the gallery for Flow, you'll notice if I look at Yammer sentiment and search on that, you'll see that there's actually a pre-built Flow template, which is actually what I base this solution on, that can actually go out and help you to monitor negative posts on Yammer. The nice thing with these Flow templates is once you go ahead and create an instance, you instantiate an instance of the Flow, you can then customize it and do whatever you want with it. And there's a whole set of different Flow templates that already exist, very similar to as consumers. If you've used things like if this, then that, and have these recipes of pre-built templates, a number of pre-built templates that exist for you inside of Microsoft Flow. Now, when I first created this flow, it first showed up as my flows. I then went ahead and shared this flow with others in my organization, which then promoted it to be a team flow. So you see here is this is the flow that's set up. When you do a flow, flows can be triggered based on a number of different actions. One could be a manual flow where someone actually will click a button, such as an example, an approval workflow in a SharePoint communication site to request a page approval to publish new changes to like the HR website or the intranet. Flows can be triggered based on automatic events. So in this case, I'm leveraging one of the flow triggers to monitor the CEO Connection Yammer group, Yammer community. You can also go ahead and do flows based on a timer. So maybe it's going to run once a day, once a week, once a month, whatever the appropriate intervals are, we can go ahead and look at that as well. So I'm going to drill into the flow that I already created. You can see that here are some of the prior runs that I've done over the last month or so. So some of the prior tests that I was doing over the last week or so, just again, getting ready for the session. You notice that some of the connections that have been established as well. So I'm leveraging a few of the other connections that are available within Flow. So Flow has the ability, depending on your license type, to connect to around 300 different systems, Microsoft solutions, certainly like Office 365 and Azure, but also third-party applications as well. So if you wanted to connect to third-party applications, there are premium connectors. There's also the ability to leverage a data gateway service that gives you the ability to go out and actually connect to on-premises databases and applications as well, such as SQL Server or Oracle as an example. But what I'm leveraging here is some of the pre-built connections to leverage things around notifications, the ability to translate things into different languages, as well as leveraging the text analytics service, which is an Azure cognitive service. You'll also notice, as I mentioned again earlier, that I've shared this with a group of people. So the Microsoft Technology Center architects, which is a shared demo environment that we leverage across the 50 Microsoft Technology Centers that we have available globally, as well as I've explicitly shared this with one of my colleagues, Paul, as well as an explicit group, in this case, the product services group as well. So I'm going to drill in and look at the actual workflow. So as I mentioned earlier, when I first created the flow, it enabled me to then connect it to my Yammer network. So in my case, this is the one MTC, one Microsoft Technology Center production environment that, again, we leverage across all 55 Microsoft Technology Centers globally. I then told it which Yammer community or Yammer groups I wanted to monitor. So in this case, I'm monitoring the CEO connection, which is that Yammer community that I showed you earlier. Now, flows, as I mentioned, execute off of a trigger, and then you can perform one or more different action. And you're going to see the ability to very simply design and develop this workflow that can have different logic. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm monitoring this CEO connection community. Whenever this Yammer community gets a new message posted to it, it then goes out and it takes in the message from Yammer, and then it posts it into the Azure Cognitive Service that's doing sentiment analysis. So Microsoft Azure has a number of different cognitive services. Examples of them might be speech to text, language translation, in this case, sentiment analysis. The sentiment analysis service could be leveraged, in this case, to monitor the sentiment based on a post to Yammer, by me passing in the post from Yammer, but it can also be leveraged to look at other things like people posting things on Twitter, as an example, or any other content or text that I want to post into this as well. I can do this. Now, as an output of the post, you notice that I then go ahead and log this into a SharePoint list. Now, the reason why I did this is I needed somewhere to persist the data, because remember, I wanted to build a report that's looking at information over time. I certainly could have just sent off the email notification. I could have just posted to Teams, but because I wanted to build that report, I needed somewhere to persist the data. I happen to pick a SharePoint list that's connected to the HR website that I have there. I could have leveraged the common data service. I could have leveraged a database. I could have stored the data anywhere else. So I'm going to show you where that list lives and what that list looks like. So if I go back to my HR website, excuse me, and if I drill into the site contents, you'll notice that there is a list called the CEO Connection Sentiment Analysis. And you'll notice that every time that this flow has run, it's gone in and it's actually posted or inserted a record into this list. So if I go in and I actually look at the list itself, and I look at the list settings, you notice that the list is a pretty basic list. I'm basically looking at and keeping track of a few pieces of information. One is the title. This score is where I'm storing the result as a number that's coming back from the cognitive service that's telling me whether it thinks it's a positive or negative sentiment. I'm storing in here the hyperlink to the Yammer post. And then I'm just capturing when the flow was kicked off. And in this case, because the flow is running under the context of me, you'll notice that the modified, created by, modified by, all are using my information, because that's what the workflow was created under. So if I go back and I look at the list itself and actually click into the list, you'll notice that here is just the title. This is just the ID that's coming from Yammer. Again, here's that score from when the messages are being posted. And again, it's even looking at the response. So in this case, that 0.96, that was actually the fact that I posted a response in the community. So if I look at the Yammer community again, this is actually detecting the great question. We'll discuss it as a team and respond back. So it actually was able to distinguish the difference between the initial post as well as the reply in there as well. So there's a score. Again, there's a message link back to the post inside of Yammer. And as I mentioned, the flow is running under the context of me. So whenever it looks at the created by, the modified by, whoever, when it was modified and all that, again, that's just based on whatever I'm passing in from flow. So here again is looking at the flow. So I told it to leverage this SharePoint site. I told it to leverage this SharePoint list. And then I'm passing in the values that I just walked you through. So I'm passing in the title, which again is just the message ID that's coming from the Yammer post. I'm passing in the score, and then I'm passing in the link. The next thing that I'm doing is then looking at the comment. If the comment was determined to be negative, and if I look at that, how did I actually go ahead and determine what is negative? So in my case, I said that if the score comes back and it's less than 0.3, so if it's 30% or lower, then I'm going to determine from my organization that post is negative. Again, this is a threshold you can tweak. So as you're going through and you're becoming more and more comfortable with how the cognitive service is going and how it's actually determining whether it's positive or negative, you may find that your threshold level may want to be higher than lower than 0.3. You notice that if it's positive, I'm not doing anything with it. So I'm kind of discarding that. That's kind of a if this, then do that condition. So it's saying that if the score is 0.3 or lower, then what I'm doing is I'm first off potentially go ahead and translating it into the target language of English. So if the post in Yammer might have been in a different language, I could detect that language and I could translate it from the original language into English, because maybe the folks in HR that are monitoring this only speak English. I can go ahead and push a notification. So there is a flow app, so I can actually raise a notification that could potentially buzz someone. And again, maybe this only happens of posts that are, really, really low, like, 0.2, 0.1, et cetera. I can go ahead and do that as well. Then what I'm doing is I'm just sending out the email notification. So if I wanted to, I could certainly email an explicit individual, as I've done here. I could email a distribution list. The earlier version of this flow that I used to do, I used to email it to the channel itself. So if you look back at the original posts that were here, you notice that up until recently, I was also just sending an email notification to the channel, and that was just based on that original flow, just sending it to the actual channel email account. But recently, now that there's new capabilities available in Flow, I've decided that I want to leverage some of the new capabilities available natively inside of Teams, where I can go ahead and say, you know what, I want to go ahead and post it to this team in this channel. And again, I'm going to format the message in a similar way. So I'm going to go ahead and say that if the comment is negative, again, I'm going to go ahead and format the message. I'm going to say it's a negative comment logged on Yammer. I'm going to go ahead and grab the translated text that's inside of English. I'm going to then go ahead and put the sentiment score in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and actually give a direct link to it. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the actual subject of the message as well. So again, going back to our message here, this is basically how I went ahead and went out and actually constructed this message, just stringing together the different static text, like the subject line here, and bringing in dynamic text, such as the actual body of the post, the sentiment score that came back from sentiment analysis, as well as a link to the actual message that got posted in the Yammer community as well. The last piece of the solution that we're really looking at is really, posting the content out inside of Power BI. So for that, what I did is I leveraged the Power BI desktop tool. So this is a client application that's available on Windows. You can publish it though into Power BI. And as I mentioned, there are Power BI web parts and tabs that are available natively for SharePoint as well as for Microsoft Teams. So what I did is I just went ahead and I went out and connected to SharePoint as a data source. Just by going and say connect to a common data source, I went ahead and grabbed in SharePoint. I can go ahead and actually modify and look at the data source that's there. So if I wanted to, I can go ahead and look at the data that's already out there. I can look at the recent sources that are available that I've been working with. I can go ahead though and also look at and transform the data. So looking at the data source setting, you'll see that in this case, I've connected to that list in SharePoint. I can go ahead and change the permissions. If I wanted to move this from one area to another, which I've had to do before, when I've had to move this demo from one demo environment to another, it literally was just a matter of changing the connection to instead of pointing at this site to point at a different site. And then once I did that, I went through and actually transformed the data. So if I look at the data transformation, it basically is almost like running through a series of kind of, think about it almost as like a macro, where it first went ahead and configured the data source, went through and I navigated into the list. I then did some reformatting and renaming of some of the columns. I had to go through and do some work to change the data type for actually going ahead and doing things really around, I think, formatting some of the information for the score to get that into a usable way that I could actually create the average of it. And then I went ahead and did some sorting. At the end of it all, it built a report that looks like this, where I then had the ability to go ahead and publish it out to the Power BI service. Now, over time, I can certainly get much fancier, and I can go ahead and put in other visualizations. I just went ahead and just grabbed a very basic chart here, a column chart. But then I went ahead and actually published this out into the Power BI service. Once I did that, it then got published up into Power BI into this workspace that actually have available for what we call intranet reports. And if I actually go ahead and look at the settings on this report, if I look at the data sets, you can see it doesn't need to connect through a data gateway because it knows that it's connecting directly into SharePoint Online. It's leveraging my credentials into my user account to connect to the SharePoint source. If I wanted to, we can actually start to apply sensitivity labels. So if I had data classification labels that I wanted to apply to information protection, and now I can apply that to documents, but I can also apply this to Power BI reports. I can apply it to Office 365 groups that, things like modern SharePoint team sites and teams are built on top of as well. But again, having the ability to apply a sensitivity label to this data set, because maybe this should be labeled as company confidential, and we want to restrict access potentially to this report as well. The key thing here is I also went ahead and scheduled the data refresh. So I went ahead and scheduled this to run. You can either do it weekly or daily. I've got it scheduled to run once per day Eastern time. I think I have it running early in the morning Eastern, and I certainly can go ahead and notify certain people as well if there was a problem with the data being refreshed. I can also go ahead and do things and create featured questions and answers where if we want people to go ahead and basically do some artificial intelligence and actually talk to the report itself and ask things in a natural language syntax, where maybe it's a human asking some questions that they want to ask of the report as well. But again, at the end of the day, it just goes out and it builds this report that then we can go ahead and leverage the out-of-the-box tab inside of Teams to go ahead and bring that report directly in as a tab. I just went ahead and then just wired up that report, and then similarly went ahead and wired up the report back on the HR website, back on the feedback page as well. And that was really all it took to go ahead and build this out. This solution end to end took me a couple of hours to build. The biggest challenge with building the solution was really just thinking about how we wanted to store the data and where we wanted that to be persisted, and then actually go ahead and building out the information into the, building the report out, publishing the report, and then going ahead and actually embedding it inside of Teams and inside of the SharePoint page as well. And as I mentioned, you're going to have access to this blog post if you haven't seen it already, as well as the steps in the solution package to build something similar in your environment if you want to do that as well. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes left on this session. And what I wanted to spend the last 10 minutes certainly is, again, asking, taking any questions that you might have. So feel free to throw some questions out there in the chat if you have questions about the solution. But I did want to walk you through kind of the building blocks of how the solution was assembled. So as I mentioned, from a solution architecture perspective, first step was building the community inside of Yammer. So creating that CEO connection community. Again, showed you the new experience for the new Yammer, how you can create that CEO connection community. Some of the new things we have available for designating things as a question, as an example. It really showed you how that CEO connection community can be leveraged to engage the employees in a broader company-wide conversation. I then leveraged Microsoft Power Automate, formerly Microsoft Flow, leveraged that pre-built template to go ahead and monitor the Yammer community, then leverage the Azure Cognitive Service to go out there and do the text sentiment analysis. Once we did that, then certainly leverage that condition to go ahead and generate and send the email notification. So that's how we sent that email, just using an out-of-the-box connector that's available in Flow to send an email. There's a pre-formatted template that's available to go ahead and create that email message that gets sent out to the recipients via Outlook and Exchange. Then went through and leveraged SharePoint to create that list. That's where we actually stored the results. That's also how we built the page in the SharePoint site, where we embedded the Power BI report as well. Then, as I mentioned, leverage the Power BI desktop client to create the report, connect to the SharePoint list as the data source, publish the report to the Power BI service, then go ahead and have it scheduled on a regular basis to go out there and actually refresh the report automatically, then leverage the out-of-the-box web part to, again, publish that inside of Teams, to have that report available inside of Teams as a tab, as well as inside of SharePoint as a web part. And then Teams is really the centralized space where we created that team. We then had multiple channels inside of the team. So we had the CEO Connection feedback channel where the posts were being posted from the flow, leveraging that new connector that's available to post directly into Teams. So you saw how I posted it to a specific team, to a specific channel, and then pumped in the message. That private team is then a space where the members of the HR team can go ahead and communicate with each other, collaborate, ask and answer questions. But then you also then saw how we embedded that Power BI dashboard, how we could have an ongoing conversation about the report. We could have a discussion around potentially looking at the video, forms, etc., all inside of Teams as one integrated workspace as well. From a resources perspective, again, aka.ms, Yammer sentiment, that is where you can access the first blog post that I showed you, where again, it does have a link directly to the code sample, which then takes you to the second article. As I mentioned, there is a zip file you can download that you can then go ahead and connect it. From a end user perspective, pretty much everything that I did here can be done just as a citizen developer with really no extra privileges, depending on how your company has set up rights inside of Power Automate, and then certainly your ability to create teams and SharePoint sites and pages. The one exception to that is the actual Azure Cognitive Service. So that is a cognitive service that someone that has the rights inside of Azure would have to provision or give you access to the Azure Cognitive Services. They'll have to give you the key and the endpoint that you want to pass the text into. So that is something where if you're not someone that has rights inside of Azure, that cannot spin up your own cognitive services, that you don't know what the API key is, you don't know what the endpoint is, you don't even know what those terms really mean, you would then potentially need to work with an Azure administrator in your organization to create the appropriate resource group and resources. But again, everything else, creating the team, creating the flow, the Power BI report, creating the actual SharePoint site, the list, the pages, and all that are all things that you can do as a citizen developer, just using out-of-the-box Teams and SharePoint and Flow capabilities as well. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes left in the session, and again, certainly happy to take any additional questions that are showing up in the QA. So I do see a question there. Do you need a certain license to post the Power BI report to SharePoint? Yeah, that's a great question. So to publish the report into Power BI and then have it scheduled to refresh on an ongoing basis, you do need the Power BI Pro license. So certainly anyone can leverage the Power BI desktop client, as I did, to connect to the data source and then manually refresh the report, and then it'll be exported to Excel. But if you do want to publish it to the Power BI service and you want to have the report be scheduled on an ongoing basis, and then leverage the tab in Teams or the web part inside of SharePoint, you do need the Power BI, at least Power BI Pro license, to create and publish and schedule that report. So that is a good question there as well. So again, certainly would love your continued questions and feedback that's out there. If you haven't had an opportunity already, please do visit our vendors, our sponsors, attend their virtual booths, watch their videos, go ahead and submit that raffle based on the answers that you discover by watching their videos. There will be, you have to have correct answers, and then you'll get a chance to win an Oculus Quest device. Again, if you are willing and able and in a position to do so, really this is for and by the community. I know many folks are still struggling across the globe to deal with the response to this global pandemic. Myself, I'm based here in Boston, Massachusetts. We've just recently started to reopen our state and kind of phase one of our response. I have a sister-in-law who's a nurse at Mass General in the hospital, so I know so many first responders are still dealing with this pandemic across the globe. So if you are able to support any of the charities here, donate any money. Again, some of the proceeds of this, 10% of the money coming from our sponsors will be given to support our community as well. So again, I do appreciate our sponsors as well as anything else that others can do to go ahead and contribute to this cause to help us all overcome this. Again, would love your feedback on the event overall. So certainly there is the ability to give feedback on the overall event, as well as feedback on my session, any other session. Again, we do appreciate your feedback. We appreciate you attending this event. This is our first time doing this, as Joel and others mentioned, that hopefully this will be another round of this will happen hopefully again in the fall. So would love your feedback on these virtual sessions, as well as the overall event, to continue to help us to improve on our delivery for these as well. With that, I've got about 5 minutes left, which again, I'm happy to answer any of the questions that might be thrown into the Q&A. If you have other questions beyond this is my handle on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter as well as LinkedIn. I usually will post things at least a couple times a day around news and announcements across all of Microsoft 365. Again, my focus really is around Microsoft 365 overall, whether it's Teams or Yammer or SharePoint. Do a ton with security and compliance. Actually have a second session that I'm presenting tomorrow afternoon Eastern time around security and governance around Office 365 and Teams and groups in SharePoint. So if you're inclined to join that session, I think it's tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock Eastern. We're going to get a lot more into security and compliance for Microsoft 365. I do blog fairly regularly. This is where the original blog post showed up around this Yammer sentiment analysis solution. It's also been syndicated and cross-posted onto the Microsoft tech community as well. If you are in the Boston area, certainly would love to see you either in a virtual Microsoft Technology Center engagement, or again, as we do more and more community events, do a ton with the local SharePoint Saturday New England. We had hoped to launch Teams Thursday New England. That unfortunately had to get canceled because of the pandemic, and we're now participating in this broader event thanks to Joel and Jeff and Ryan and everyone else inviting us to be part of it. But certainly when things reopen, would love to see you at some community events. I will be presenting at the Boston Office 365 user group later in June around Project Cortex. So again, if you're in the area, it's going to be online. Would love to see you at that session or any future sessions as well. So with that, I'm right around time. Again, really appreciate the sponsors, the community for putting on this event and inviting myself and others to present on it. Appreciate you all coming to this session tonight. Again, apologies for the hiccups earlier today at 2 Eastern. Do appreciate you joining the session later on today. Again, this is being recorded. The slides will be published. The recording will be published. And again, really thank you all for coming.